Welcome to the Afterglow podcast, a space to practice Yoga Nidra informed by the ideas of Carl Jung and internal family systems. Each week we will work on a different life theme, giving us the opportunity to discover vast inner landscapes, sitting with all that life has to offer as we explore who we are. May the afterglow be as bright as the journey is deep. Welcome to today's episode, where I will be talking with breastfeeding expert Emma Pickett. Through our chat today, we can hear about the work that Emma does, the types of complexities that surrounding breastfeeding and chest feeding, and I will try and get a sense of how to best build a Yoga Nidra that will suit people who are breastfeeding or who will be breastfeeding soon. Emma, a very warm welcome and hello. Thank you so much for joining me today in this discussion. If I may, I'd like to give a... Sorry?
I said, thank you for asking me. I'm very happy to be here.
Great. If I may, I'm going to give a little intro into who you are and the type of work that you do. Emma Pickett is a board-certified lactation consultant and a breastfeeding counselor. She runs a podcast called Makes Milk that follows the journey of breast and chest feeding from beginning to end. She talks about all the different needs of the babies, the parents, medical intersections such as breastfeeding with diabetes, and she speaks extensively around different ways to wean, and she also interviews a lot of other guests to hear about their stories of trials and successes. She has also authored several books, including her most recent one, The Story of Jessie's Milkies, a weaning book for toddlers and older children. In addition, her website, breastfeedingsupport.com, that is Pickett, has tons of great resources and information for parents at any point in their journey. Now, to start us off, I would really like to ask you, Emma, about your journey as a breastfeeding consultant. How did you start? Where are you now? And how has your view on breastfeeding and the trends of breastfeeding been shaped by the work that you do and the people that you've spoken to, hearing all of these stories and doing all of your research?
Okay, big question. I'll try not to take up the entire episode by answering it. So my background professionally used to be in education. So I was a primary school teacher in central London before I had my kids. I got pregnant while I was a deputy head teacher and a year 6 teacher. So that's the last year of primary school or elementary school in the UK. And then I got pregnant and I didn't have any family experience with breastfeeding, didn't know anyone close by me who'd breastfed. I wasn't breastfed myself, no mothers, no mother-in-laws, but I'd grown up with very big boobs throughout my life. I was always quite large-chested, so I thought, well, these darn well better do something for me. So when I started breastfeeding my own son, I did have a few problems. I had struggled with overproduction and certainly didn't get much sleep for a very long time, but I started to read more about breastfeeding, educate myself, support the friends that I did meet postnatally who had babies, and then fell into training as a peer supporter. So this is back in 2005. Then became a breastfeeding counsellor, which is the next level up, where takes sort of 18 months-ish to train, and I became a volunteer on the National Breastfeeding Helpline. And then once you start researching lactation, you often can't stop. You just keep going. You just realize there's more and more to learn. So kept going, became a lactation consultant in 2011. And that just means I took an exam, essentially. To take the exam to become a lactation consultant, you have to have done 1,000 hours of support before you take the exam and 95 hours of specific education in the 5 years prior. And yeah, just kept going and then didn't go back to education just because I was working sort of 60, 70-hour weeks and it just felt a little bit counterintuitive to look after other people's children when I had my own children at home. So I've now had 2 children and was lucky enough to be able to have a bit of time to set up a private practice. So I have a little private practice, but most of my time is actually spent writing and educating and doing the podcast and volunteering. So I volunteer for 2 sessions a week where I live in North London for the local breastfeeding support service. And then otherwise I have clients from all around the world. At the moment, a lot of my work is focused on older children breastfeeding because I realized sort of during the pandemic, that a lot of people who are breastfeeding beyond babyhood were really struggling to get specific support.
Mm.
Most local areas in the world will support you if you've got a 2-month-old and you're finding breastfeeding hard. Not many local areas will support you if you've got a 2-year-old and you're finding breastfeeding hard. And lots of the parents who are continuing to feed beyond babyhood are feeling very isolated and may not know anyone else in real life who's still feeding, and really struggling with that sense of isolation, and friends and family starting to go quiet where they used to be supportive around breastfeeding. So I felt that this was a population that really did need specific support. So my book 3 books ago was about supporting people breastfeeding beyond 6 months. The book after that was about supporting people on the ending of their journeys, because again, I realized that people who breastfed responsively and really connected with their children through breastfeeding found it really difficult to bring breastfeeding journeys to an end in a way that felt loving and gentle and authentic to their relationship. They were pushed into making decisions around weaning that they didn't like and didn't feel right. So I wanted to provide people with a model that really fitted with their parenting philosophy a bit more. So I've been focusing on weaning and ending journeys, and those were the last 2 books that I wrote, and that's been the focus of a lot of my podcast episodes. So in terms of how breastfeeding's changed, social media has come along while I've been in the breastfeeding world. When I started, it was the very, very, very early days of social media, and that was message boards. We're talking pre-Facebook.
Mm.
You'd go on a board and there'd be a conversation thread, and now obviously people are going into their pockets multiple times an hour in many cases. Lots of younger mums are really living with the communities that come through TikTok and Instagram, and there are huge benefits to that in the breastfeeding world. I think people are often very negative about social media, but I think particularly when it comes to breastfeeding and natural term breastfeeding, there are huge positives to that. But I've also seen in 20 years not a lot of progress when it comes to cultural change around breastfeeding in a wider sense, and not a lot of progress when it comes to health professional training around breastfeeding. So that's it in a nugget. Is there anything you want me to develop a bit more?
Well, just a very quick technical question. What is natural term? What is the definition of natural term?
So when we continue to breastfeed beyond babyhood, there are lots of different ways to describe it. Some people call it extended breastfeeding, but I think we can all probably agree that's not great language if we want to normalize it.
Sure.
Some people just call it breastfeeding older children. There was a piece of research that came out a few years ago that found that lots of parents who are feeding beyond babyhood like the term natural term breastfeeding, the idea that if you leave everything to its own devices, how long would humans breastfeed for? If we switch off the cultural noise and the pressure around the sexualization of the breast, what do we do as a species? There's a really nice essay written by an American anthropologist called Catherine Detweiler called The Natural Age of Weaning. And it talks about if you compare us to the other primates and look at markers like body size and sexual maturity and immune system, and when our teeth shift, and all the different signs of how you measure someone getting bigger, when they triple their birth weight, etc., humans would probably wean somewhere between 2.5 and 7 years old. And so that word natural probably is slightly influenced by that article. So we always have to be a bit careful when we use the word natural when we talk about anything to do with birth or the postnatal experience, because it implies that people who don't do it are somehow unnatural.
Yeah.
But natural term just means letting it play itself out, essentially. So lots of people breastfeeding older children will talk about natural term weaning or natural term breastfeeding.
Great. I'll try and find a link to the article and I'll put it in the show notes as well, along with your website. So, Emma, I'd like to get stuck into some of the emotional, psychological side of things. And this next question is sort of a two-in-one. I'm really keen to know what sort of things you have noticed in the general sort of psyche of mums struggling when it comes to breastfeeding. And this is that's sort of one half of the question. And then the other half is around this idea of woman's intuition or mother's intuition. Because, and I ask this because when I'm sitting thinking and imagining, I've never had children, I've never breastfed, and I'm trying to sort of put myself in the shoes of someone going through this experience. Immediately what comes to my mind is this pressure, or this sort of the trick that kind of happens when it comes to this idea of intuition, where we kind of double bluff ourselves sometimes, and it can be the sort of thing of, why there's all this sort of external noise, and sometimes we feel like we really should know better, and are we second guessing ourselves? And there's like, if there's something that has sort of put us on a rocky start when it comes to breastfeeding, if there is a sort of psychological sort of thing that happens there with some people who are trying to sort of clear out the noise so that they can sort of get into the space of what feels right for me. And then also, is that concept of sort of mother's intuition, is that sometimes maybe even detrimental, because then maybe people feel like there's something wrong that it hasn't kicked in. And just sort of what the sort of, I guess it's also just in general an opening to what do you find as some of the sort of typical kind of psychological experiences that are happening for people who are breastfeeding, sort of in the early days, if things are not going exactly as smoothly as they would like it to be.
Okay, so big question, but let me have a go. So lots of women that grow up in, the kind of cultures that I'm living in, which is the United Kingdom. That's true of people in sort of Western Europe and America and Australia. We grow up feeling that our bodies are not good enough. From a very young age, we've got people who are working really hard to sell us stuff, and you don't sell us stuff until you tell someone their body is lacking something. So, when we were little, we talked about magazines and billboards, and now it's not that. It's the magazine in your pocket where the algorithm is stretching in a certain direction to push you to your Korean face masks and your slimming clothing and your diet, etc. So young women are told their bodies are not good enough, and then suddenly when they're pregnant, they're meant to believe that suddenly you're wonderful and fantastic and your body does this wonderful thing and everything's going to be okay and your body's completely sufficient and aren't you wonderful and nature's fantastic. And that mental switch is quite an ask for someone who's grown up being told that they're deficient. And that means that some
Yeah.
people in the early stages of breastfeeding haven't quite switched off that deficiency voice.
Mm-hmm.
And that leads to something called perceived insufficiency of milk supply,
Mm-hmm.
even PIM, if you want to get fancy. And it actually means that for most women in the world, you're more likely to worry that you don't have enough milk, even if you do.
Mm.
So there are some women who genuinely have medical reasons or physical reasons why they don't make a full milk supply and may always need to give baby extra milk. But we're talking about, less than 10%, potentially less than 5%. The majority of people will make enough milk, but despite that, huge numbers of people will worry that they're not. Even if all the evidence points in the right direction in terms of babies' nappies and babies' weight gain, there'll still be this little voice in their head that tells them, oh no, my baby wants to feed again, even though it's only been an hour and a half.
Mm.
If I had the right amount of milk, in inverted commas, they should go 3 hours.
Mm.
I'm measuring on this app that tells me how often my baby's feeding. Oh, yay, they went 4 hours, not 3 hours. So that idea that you've got this kind of external measurement and the universe is judging your milk supply every moment, every day is something that some women do find difficult to switch off. I
Mm.
wrote an article about this, which you can find on the UNICEF Baby Friendly website, the
Okay.
UK version of the UNICEF Baby Friendly website, which talks about the dangerous obsession with infant feeding intervals. That means the kind of gaps between feeds. So
Mm-hmm.
the people that are struggling psychologically are often the ones who've fallen into the trap of looking for external validation
Mm-hmm.
without thinking about their baby necessarily and looking at their baby. They're looking at
Mm-hmm.
milliliters and hours and minutes instead of
Mm.
looking at their baby. Um,
Yeah.
and then there's this big concept in breastfeeding of which is self-efficacy, your belief that you're going to be able to do it. And we know that people that go into their breastfeeding journey saying, "Yeah, I pretty much think this is going to work," just makes an enormous difference. Whereas the people that go in saying, well, it didn't work for my sister, it didn't work for my mum, it didn't work for my best friend, I'm not kind of expecting it to work, I'm going to give it a go, but I don't really have much faith that it will work, that makes an enormous difference. So it's a bit of a cliche to talk about positive thinking, but in the world of breastfeeding, that really, really makes a huge difference, because it means if someone doesn't do the positive thinking, they don't trust their baby. They think
Mm.
their baby is a little liar. They think their baby can't be right. Their baby is
Mm.
telling them they're hungry again, and surely they can't be. We're
Mm.
not going to trust our baby's sleeping patterns or weight gain. We're going to assume that the baby's not telling the truth, in inverted commas. So people who struggle psychologically are ones who don't kind of have faith in their baby and have a sense of their baby being normal, have bigger messages around their bodies not being sufficient.
Mm.
and then not necessarily believing in breastfeeding itself, not thinking that breastfeeding has a wider value. That concept of mother's intuition is hugely important, because I would describe it maybe as our subconscious, and it's our conscious that's often been contaminated by cultural messaging, that's absorbed the commercialization of women's bodies and the messages around how babies should be behaving. If we switch off that noise and tap into our subconscious, we're going to tap into the millions of years of evolution that have got us until now. If evolution can produce the human eye, if evolution can produce the human pancreas, why can't it manage lactation? And if you switch off that cultural noise, and the app that tells you, oh no, your baby's fed after just 2 hours, and say, hang on, my breasts are incredibly complex things that have zillions of little cells and are synthesizing milk from my blood, and gosh, how clever and sophisticated that is. Why do I assume that's not going to work? And that doesn't happen on a logic level. That happens on a much deeper body level. So I guess we could call that instinct, that faith and that belief, which is about switching off that conscious brain, that some of that cultural messaging, particularly around sexualization of the breast, as breastfeeding continues, as we start to get more voices saying, oh gosh, they can walk and they're still breastfeeding, isn't that a bit weird? That's when you've really got to come down deep and say, hang on, this feels right. This feels right for my child, and this feels right for me. And I don't have to be able to put that into words even. I don't even have to make that case to you, because something about this feels right. And I'm going to prioritize how that feels for me and my child. So yeah, I'm going to use the word subconscious rather than instinct, but I guess it is the same thing. It's just switching off that external voice.
Yeah. Well, you're speaking my language in terms of Yoga Nidra is essentially you're bringing yourself into a state of semi-consciousness and semi-sleep, and it's a way to sort of engage with the unconscious mind in a really sort of safe, relaxed space where you can allow things to ripple up in a way that doesn't feel overwhelming. And it's that inner voice. Again, I mentioned the word semantics to you earlier. Sometimes I do think that, which word sounds right in my ear versus someone else. Sometimes we can get lost in the weeds a bit, and I think that ultimately, as long as the general concept is being sort of conveyed, that's the important thing. And it's this thing of sitting with yourself, of really getting a sense of deep comfort and familiarity with trusting yourself, having that relationship, and being able to follow through. And I think that's kind of why I wanted to sort of open up with this idea of mother's instinct, because I've heard so many people, friends of mine who've had babies, or my own parents, or my sisters who are much older than me, people talking about how sort of much of a headspin that can kind of put you in, where you're sort of self-doubting, and then you can kind of get into a bit of a maze, and it can be really hard to just sort of push aside all of this externality and sit and be present and focused. So
Yeah.
so that's amazing what you're saying. I can completely see and understand everything. And
It's
yeah.
particularly right now in human history. I think it's more important than it's ever been. So
Yeah.
in the 20th century, not to get into too much of the finer details about the
No, I
history of
love the details. Go
childbirth,
for
but
it.
we went really off-piste when in the sort of 1950s onwards. So we had messaging from the beginning of the 20th century about controlling babies and separating babies from mothers, and good mothers made sure that their babies didn't sleep in their arms and they were put down. And we started to get that messaging around routines, and good babies feeding after only feeding off every 4 hours and not more frequently than that, which sabotaged breastfeeding throughout the sort of 60s and 70s and 80s. We had some of the lowest breastfeeding rates in human history in the West in those eras, when the message was dominated by mostly male driven messaging around science around breastfeeding and science around infant feeding. So when my husband was born in the early 70s, his mother was not allowed to care for him overnight. They were not allowed to night feed. Their babies were put in nurseries and not fed for multiple hours at a time, which we know now is biologically really a bad idea. So lots of people were only allowed to feed for sort of 10 minutes on each breast. And I'm using the word allowed because
Mm.
women were really encouraged to not listen to their instincts. They were
Mm.
really encouraged to follow a piece of paper and follow the rules. And so, the generation really not very far away. So for most of the young mums listening to this, it will be their grannies.
Mm-hmm.
It really wasn't long ago that women were literally told to switch off their instincts. Their instincts were naughty, wrong, led them down
Yeah.
the path of accidental parenting or lazy parenting, created lazy babies. And then we started to learn more about infant development and neurology and psychology and attachment and attachment parenting and what that actually means in terms of forming bonds between parents and babies. And we've done a complete 180 flip now, and now the establishment, the health system, is talking about responsive breastfeeding and relationship building and bonding.
Mm.
But all that cultural history, all that support that would have been around us, the whole village of women that would have said, hey, this is how we breastfeed, we've lost it in a big chunk of the planet.
Yeah.
So if you're a young mum and you're breastfeeding, chances are probably your mother and grandmother didn't have a very successful breastfeeding relationship. And the people who trained the health professionals that are supporting you probably didn't feel very positively about breastfeeding. So we really do have to do a bit of extra work
Mm.
to reach down deep and listen
Yeah.
to those messages. Even something as simple as co-sleeping, which means sharing your sleeping space with your baby. Even just 10 years ago, the messaging from the health professionals was often, oh no, you shouldn't really be doing that. That's not super sensible or super safe. We now know that between 70 and 80% of breastfeeding families are co-sleeping. And
Mm.
even in the period where we told them not to, they were still doing it. And actually research shows that it's not more dangerous if you follow guidance and you do so, without not being under the influence of alcohol or certain drugs. If the sleeping space is safe, it's no more dangerous for a baby to bed share. And it actually means that breastfeeding outcomes are more successful. So we had lots of people who were doing it anyway, secretly, without talking about it, a bit naughtily, in inverted commas, because it felt like the right thing to do.
Mm.
And a version of that is happening in the breastfeeding world, when
Mm.
people get to sort of 12, 18 months and they're still breastfeeding and nothing in the wider society is telling them it's a great idea. They're having to listen to that voice.
Mm.
And it's really powerful to watch women do that. I mean, I had a consultation this week with a mum. I won't go into details because I don't have the permission to share, but she thought she was going to be ending breastfeeding. And actually, when we talked, it was really clear that actually that was coming from a part of her brain that was the logic part of her brain, the
Mm.
external voices, the externalities, you say. And actually, when she dug down deep, and I was able to help her explore that and thought about her child and thought about what worked for her and her child in those moments, she
Mm.
realized that she wasn't ready to end breastfeeding,
Yeah.
but she needed to have a space to think that through and to dig down deep and tap into those moments that feel more authentic and truthful. And then she realized what she did really want to do.
Yeah.
But when you're having a busy life and you're working and you're flitting from one thing to the next, you don't have space to do that thinking. So you'll
Mm.
often listen to other people's opinions a bit more. You'll read things on TikTok or see things on TikTok and absorb that maybe rather than listen to your own voice. So even the super busy mums really do need to have a moment to think, hang on,
Yeah.
what is actually right for me and my child? What is actually the right thing for us? You've got to have space to be able to do that thinking.
Yeah, yeah. In one of my questions that's coming up in a bit, I'll share a little bit of background and the sort of some of the breastfeeding stories that sort of float around my psyche and my sort of family of origin. You sort of, everyone has these sort of archetypal stories that have just been kind of, sort of hanging over their heads in terms of what was done in their family and everything that your parents sort of unconsciously probably just sort of share with you, and then it sort of formulates your perception of breastfeeding. So I will mention that a bit more in a minute, but I think that what you're saying, it really gives me the sense of there's been like an unnecessary weight that has been put on us, and now we're having to go through this enormous effort to take this weight off of us, and
Yeah.
there was never a reason to put this weight on us, and now we're having to like sort of re-examine and I mean, even beyond the time frame of physical production of milk. I don't even have children, and already I feel like I'm having to push people's opinions off of me because I'm nearly 40, and everyone is saying, oh, your risk of breast cancer is much higher if you don't breastfeed, and or your geriatric pregnancies are so much more dangerous, and you're going to have so many more problems, and I'm not even pregnant, never mind anything else. So it's really this kind of bewildering how unconsciously we're sort of putting these sort of expectations on each other. And I don't want to assume that people's general intention is bad. I think that they're probably operating from a place of fear a lot of the time, and wanting to sort of protect each other. But the net result, I think, is, as you're saying, is that we're creating a lot of external pressure, and we're taking people away from just the quiet, contained sort of sense of self-assured. You mentioned, what was it? Could you
So
remind me?
self-efficacy is that word
Self-efficacy,
about
yes. Yeah.
belief. I mean, I think you're being a very positive, kind person in thinking that it's not always intentional. I'm afraid to say, if we look at the history, there's a brilliant book called The Politics of Breastfeeding by Gabrielle Palmer. I'm afraid through human history, it's sometimes been intentional because
I'm sure.
misogyny is doing it for powerful reasons. If industrialization requires the workforce to be out of the home and back in the workplace, and if they want to breastfeed for 2 years, that doesn't work as easily. And there are reasons why we want babies to be separated from mothers. I mean, Gabrielle talks about hospitals being designed purposely to separate babies and mothers.
Mm.
Hospital wards, making sure that the nursery where babies used to go separately was on a different level, so mums wouldn't have that much contact with their babies during 24 hours. The concept of a nursery, the idea, the American movies where all the babies are lined up, we don't even have that in the UK, but all
Mm.
the babies being lined up and taken away from their mums and put in the nursery, that's unthinkable in the context of
Mm.
sorting out the bond between the baby and mother, and making sure that a mother who's in good health doesn't have
Mm.
constant contact with her baby. There are ominous reasons why that was intended.
Mm.
When we separate mothers and babies, we are disempowering women, and I'm afraid through history, when women are feeling empowered, they are intimidating. Let's not talk about the Salem witch trials or witchcraft generally as a concept in Europe. I mean, there's it all connects. Midwives were the witches. Midwives were the people who had that ancient knowledge. And when women say, my body is powerful, no, I can do this, actually. I can breastfeed. I can be a woman who's successful in all areas of life. Some
Mm.
people don't like that. So it's not
Yeah.
always coming from a benign place. Sometimes this reclaiming is political. And it's something that is done in a kind of conscious way as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think the sort of, my intention in saying, I don't think that it's always coming from a bad place, is more when you're in the company of other women and people. I think because that's 95% of the information or the conversations I've had between me and the women in my family or my female friends, and it's this. I think that a lot of it is. Now shifting, and people are sort of more saying, don't disregard everyone else, just focus on you. And I think that's becoming more and more of a concept. But uh the a lot of the sort of the negative sort of warnings, they're sort of like, I'm just warning you, I'm trying to help you. I think
Yeah.
that is often coming from a space of internal anxiety that's sort of then getting put out onto others, and
Yeah.
I
I
think that
mean,
it
we know
does.
that. Sorry, I'm talking over you. Sorry,
No,
Ella.
no, it's all right. I was
I'll
just going to
just
say, I think it does require an enormous amount of internal strength to sort of hold space for yourself, and if possible, maybe I'm being idealistic, to even hold space for the other person who's clearly feeling anxious, and it's sort of
yeah.
spilling out into the world around them.
No, I don't think that's idealistic. I think that's what modern mums need to do, because
Yeah.
the people around us, are often experiencing trauma from their own feeding experiences. I
Mm.
mean, we know that from the last infant feeding survey in the UK, 80% of women aren't reaching their breastfeeding goals. That's a
Wow.
lot of people who are feeling traumatized.
Yeah.
And certainly for the generation above us, when they were told they only had to feed once every 4 hours and told they shouldn't be feeding overnight, that was a generation for whom, potentially their mothering was even more central to their identity as who they were if they didn't get professional opportunities. And
Yeah.
then when they see us breastfeeding responsibly or breastfeeding for longer term, that feels very intimidating. And this is all happening subconsciously, but every time you continue to feed beyond 12 months and your mother-in-law stopped at 8 months, you're saying to your mother-in-law, what you did was not right. What you did
Mm.
was not how it should have been. What
Mm.
you did was not what I agree with.
Mm.
And it takes a very wise older woman to see that and go, okay, this is different now, and I want to support
Mm.
my daughter-in-law, my daughter, to do something
Mm.
different, and I want them to have that feeling of success and to reach that goal without seeing it as implicitly some kind of criticism. There's
Mm.
a really interesting book called Breast Intentions,
Mm-hmm.
which is quite controversial because it talks about how some of the women who are traumatized do sabotage other people's breastfeeding relationships,
Mm.
and without realizing that's what they're doing.
Mm.
And there's a lot of trauma. I mean, trauma is the word. I mean that on a sort of scientific basis.
Oh yeah.
Professor Amy Brown, has a really good book about breastfeeding, grief, and trauma. Lots of people around us who are giving the warnings
Mm-hmm.
are actually traumatized by what happened in their own breastfeeding journey because they didn't get the support they needed. They might have had a pain or difficulty and they didn't get the right information. Their breastfeeding journey ended quickly because of that. And you're right, we have to look after ourselves, but then also be aware that some of that stuff coming on top of us, some of that extra weight, is other people's trauma just because of the society we live in. So
Yeah.
even more important that you can tap into that internal voice. And when
Yeah.
your aunt is saying, "Oh no, don't, breastfeeding isn't great. Be careful. Your baby's not going to get enough milk. They're going to lose weight. You're not going to make enough milk." Where that voice is coming from, you have to have a real strength to create that kind of buffer to absorb that and say, okay, I can see where she is coming from. That's from her experience.
Mm.
I'm not going to let that contaminate me because my
Mm.
story is different. But as you imply, we're at a very vulnerable point in our own lives. We haven't got the
Mm.
capacity to support and therapize everyone around us.
Mm.
So it's intense. There's a lot
Yeah.
going on.
It's a lot. It's a lot. So on your podcast, you often talk about the intersection of breastfeeding and medical things that crop up. So whether it's tongue ties or mastitis or anything that's a physical concern. And I'm interested in the aspects of parenthood that may be a little bit harder to pin down. I think that sometimes, in a way, if it's a quickly solvable medical thing, it must be a bit of almost a relief than if it's something more psychological or nebulous. I mean, maybe I'm completely wrong. Please tell me if I am. But I guess that this question is more of an open question around the sort of those things that are difficult to pin down, and when you are having to sort of play detective and figure out, where is it coming from? Is it a medical thing? No, you've sort of probably eliminated most of the medical physical concerns that could be happening. Then is insufficient sleep or stress? Is it external pressures, which you've mentioned already? So I guess that I'm, this is a an open question in terms of how do you go about trying to sort of put a sort of maybe put a pin in it is the wrong thing because you never really know, but yeah, how do you try and isolate certain things that could be creating difficulty in the, especially I imagine the beginning part of breastfeeding? And even in saying that, I'm realizing now it's probably very common where a mother's going along perfectly fine breastfeeding, and then after 4 months all of a sudden something goes wrong. So even in my assumption that it is an early few months thing where it's most common, I'm, even as I'm speaking, realizing that it's very possibly could just crop up, things crop up continually.
Yeah. So this is going to maybe sound a little bit arrogant, but it's actually not hard. It's
Like,
not hard.
that's good.
if
That's
you've
great.
if you've had experience and you've worked with hundreds and thousands of mothers and parents, um, we're complex animals, but we're not that complex.
Mm-hmm.
There are certain things that are very similar and similar stories. So it's all about listening. There's a reason why breastfeeding counsellors are called breastfeeding counsellors. Being a lactation consultant or anyone in this space working with new parents, so much of it is about listening. So you
Mm-hmm.
do lots of listening. You collect all the information. You talk about babies and nappies and weight gain and sleeping patterns. You watch. You watch feeds. You look at the baby feeding at the breast. You talk about the whole 24 hours and what's happening, and it's rare that
Mm.
together with the parent you don't come up with an answer. There are going to sometimes be mysteries, and there are obviously rare conditions and things where I'll need to signpost elsewhere. But the vast majority of the time, it's it's not difficult, and
That's
parents will
one.
reveal themselves what is probably going on.
Yeah.
And it can be something as simple as, I thought that how long the baby went between feeds was important, and it meant how much milk I had, and you
Yeah.
just give information, and you signpost to research, and you talk about what our bodies do, and you can unpick that. And even in just one short conversation, it's possible to unpick some of this cultural weight, some of this cultural
Mm.
noise, showing research, talking about the physicality of what our bodies are doing, pointing out things about their baby, showing how a baby's swallowing, making sure that parents can see what I can see in front of me.
Mm-hmm.
And you can even in a relatively short conversation, you can transform how somebody's feeling about their breastfeeding journey.
Mm.
Um, there are
Yeah.
lots of themes that come up again and again and again. And sometimes, as I said, in a very small minority of cases, there is a sort of physical block, which means that making a full milk supply is difficult. But even then, breastfeeding can still happen. You might be helping someone come to peace with the fact that their baby may need a little bit of extra milk alongside breastfeeding. So a lot of the time, it's just about helping parents to reveal something they already know. Um, although I started this answer by talking about being arrogant, actually, we're not the experts. Parents often know already, coming back to
Mm.
that concept of instinct,
Mm.
they already know what doesn't feel right and what does feel right. And
Yeah.
you're just showing them something that's already there. Yeah,
That's
breastfeeding
very.
works. That's why we're here as a species, That's why we're here. Humans still exist because breastfeeding has worked. Despite the challenges of the last 100 years, breastfeeding is an incredibly successful system. And it works. And if we can tap into that, it'll work for most people.
Yeah. That's very reassuring. Uh, my next question is another two-parter. Um, so I'm wondering if you've noticed, is there sort of, are there any differences when in the approach when it comes to young mums or older mums? And have you noticed any difference in the approach when it comes to parents who are breastfeeding their first child versus their second or third? And I'll give you a little bit of background as to why I'm sort of formulating this question as well, which is that so my mum had me at 40, and I was her fourth child. She had her first child at 23, I think, or in 23. She had another one at 25, and then another one at 34, and then me at 40. And her first two kids were from her first marriage, and her husband at the time, early 70s, and he thought breastfeeding was uncouth. And so she only breastfed 2 months and 3 months. And she was also working full time as a nursing sister at the time. So, between the sort of the physical nature of being a nursing sister while having two young children at home and a very unsupportive partner, uh, I don't need to convince you that that was an unfortunate set of circumstances. By the time she was in her second marriage and she had my brother, she was obviously much more confident and she was much more self assured in her body. And she, I think, had time to digest how the first sort of breastfeeding experiences had sort of uh, maybe taken her away from herself to continue the language that we've been using. And she would have breastfed my brother longer. She breastfed for 21 months. She was quite happy to continue, but then he got foot and mouth disease and he was so ill, and she had to feed him teaspoons of water throughout the day for a few days that he literally lived because he was so ill. And it sort of just forced it was a forced weaning. I don't know if that's the correct term, but uh, and so I think she's frustrated because she would have liked to have done it on her own terms. And then with me, I am a very rare case, I imagine, but she breastfed me until I was 4. And normally when people hear that, they sort of like, sort of, they completely shocked.
I won't be
And
shocked. That's my bread and butter, Ella. I meet people breastfeeding. I mean, it's great to meet an adult who's been breastfed till they were 4, but because I meet little people breastfeeding at 4 all the time, so
yeah,
that's
yeah.
great to hear.
It's definitely becoming more and more normal. And my brother's partner, she was breastfeeding well into her 40s for multiple years at a time. And I think that it's really great when you have the supportive family and you have that sort of that just overall enthusiasm that what you're doing is the right thing. And I think that we sometimes don't even realize how much of a gift it is when you do have it, that you have this sort of this sort of blanketed support, and everyone's just trusting you to make the calls that you want to make. And I do think that psychologically, part of it is potentially, compensating for less time with my sisters, and also maybe it's your last child, and you know that, oh, this is the end, and it's so wonderful, I don't want to give it up. So, there's always a psychological element to it. But I also think that ultimately, from where my mom was coming from, I think it was just even in the time between the early 70s to the late 80s, it was enough time for the perception of breastfeeding to change enough that, within one sort of motherhood span of childbearing, the perception had changed so dramatically. And I mean, I know we still have a long way to go, but I think even that sort of time span of 17 years difference between myself and my sister was enough to sort of really sort of empower women to be able to say, oh no, this is great, why wouldn't I do this, this is a phenomenal thing, I'm giving my child such an amazing gift. And I mean, I was a very healthy child, had a great immune system, and I'm aware that in saying that, it's sort of, I don't want to shame anyone who stops early and make them feel like they're not giving their child a strong, healthy immune system. So it's a sort of loaded thing. But I definitely grew up with this sort of narrative that breastfeeding for long spans of time is the greatest gift you can give your child. I mean, I sort of alluded to it earlier in the conversation, that there's a sort of internal family culture or narrative, that these sort of things that you hear flitting around as a kid, and you sort of grow up in those waters. And the waters that I grew up with was, just very pro breastfeeding, very sort of pro woman making choices for themselves. And it is strange to sort of become a bit older, and then you realize, oh, not everybody has that, and this is actually kind of revolutionary in some ways, and what a gift that I was given that I didn't even know I was given. So, and I guess that's kind of hopefully given some framework into why I'm asking the question, in terms of what you've noticed when it comes to young mums, old mums, mums who are having their kids for the first time, mums who've had maybe 3 kids, and now all of a sudden this third kid, there's something happening with the breastfeeding that's complex, and the other 2 are easy. And I guess, how do these sort of other factors play a role, and have you noticed anything in that regard?
So, I mean, I guess there's 2 parts to that. There's the bit about what have I noticed, and also what do we know from research on a kind of
Mm-hmm.
population level. We know that older women are more likely to have positive breastfeeding outcomes,
Oh.
for lots of different reasons. Uh, Higher education levels probably mean having children slightly later in life, and professional older women are the population who have the greatest breastfeeding success in the UK. That's also true in other countries in the world as well. Um, Possibly they have more time off work and they can get breastfeeding established and they're not being pushed back to work so quickly. I think it's probably also something around that self-efficacy and that self-belief. I think if you have had longer to know who you are more likely to be able to push away some of those traumatized voices. I suspect also that very, very young mums are more likely to have closer contact with, their own parents who might have had more breastfeeding trauma. Um, but having said that, I meet the 21-year-olds who are absolutely believing in themselves, who are the breastfeeding champions, who feel so strongly that this is the right thing to do. I remember many, many years ago meeting a mum in a sort of London play group, big local population of people with low income, and also we have a correlation between low socioeconomic groups and less breastfeeding. So she was living in an environment where most very young mums would not have breastfed, and she absolutely felt, no, this is right. She read a book called The Continuum Concept. She very much believed in attachment parenting, and that voice sung through. And it's interesting, if you look at the research, we don't always know why. Some people have that voice. Some people have that self-belief. It's not always detectable as to why some people get it and some people don't. In terms of subsequent babies, obviously if you've had a positive breastfeeding outcome the first time around, again, that gives you that faith. It is about faith, that belief that your body's working. You've seen it up front. You've seen it, in front of you, that it works, and therefore that anxiety, the not believing your baby, the absorption of the negative messaging, you've got more of a shell second time and third time around. It doesn't mean that problems don't come along, and I often will meet people who do have difficulties for the first time in a third or fourth pregnancy, but despite that, they still have this protective shell of, yeah, I've got a problem, but you know what? I suspect we can probably sort it out, and I believe that we probably can, and I know where to get help, and I have faith that in the end this will probably work out. So, just this week I had a conversation with somebody who, second baby, had a tongue tie, really quite complicated, needed medical attention, but they weren't panicked by that. They still had faith that things would work out. They got the tongue tie sorted, breastfeeding continued. Whereas a first time mum, that shell is a little bit thinner. Things feel a bit scarier and a bit more vulnerable and fleeting and harder to trust.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry to hear about your mum's experiences with that lack of support. I think lack of partner support is so key. I mean, we're talking about very much focused on the mother's self-belief here, but there's also a huge story in, if there is a partner, what the partner feels about breastfeeding, and the really special journeys I see are the partners who kind of step back and go, okay, I don't quite get it. I've got to go back to work. I don't really have time to read all the accounts on social media that you do, but I kind of believe you. I trust you. I have faith in you. And okay, you're feeding at 18 months. You're feeding at 2 years. I wasn't expecting that. That's not my experience. But you know what? I have faith. I can see the impact it has on our child. I believe you, and my belief in you and my trust in you is more significant than anything else about what society says or what culture says or what sexualization of the breast says. Those are the really special moments where I see partners kind of just trust the mother or parent who's breastfeeding.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I mean, I think that I think that, this shame is such a sort of buzzword, and it has been for a number of years. But I still is phenomenal how much it continually crops up, and how much it, we keep sort of seeing the sort of the shadow of it constantly floating around and coming up in all these ways in which we've sort of been removed from ourselves continually. And I guess, I mean, in so many ways, that is largely what this work that I'm trying to do is, with bringing people to themselves, to get closer, because I feel like shame primarily takes people further away from themselves, and that seems to be the most consistent sort of symptom of shame that I've noticed. So what are the sort of attitudes, or the positions, or the sort of the best setups that you have seen when it comes to this relationship of weaning in a way where the child and the mother are able to sort of do it in the most sort of harmonious way? Or I guess you can tell I'm kind of struggling with the language here, because I think that ultimately it is such an unknown thing. It's, as somebody who's never breastfed, it's almost, the sort of like, okay, and then I guess that's done now. You've entered into a new era of your life. Do children mourn, and how do they mourn? How long is an appropriate way to mourn? What about the mothers and their mourning, their experience as well? Yeah, so I mean, I guess I'm not really formulating a question, and I'm realizing that in my sort of struggle to formulate the question, I'm very aware of just how loaded this all is. It feels very loaded. I feel like I'm very conscious of being careful with how I phrase everything, and it's kind of getting in the way of me being able to just ask you, what's the deal with weaning, and what is all of the sort of psychological weight that's happening?
Okay, so No, I respect the fact it's not easy to put all this into words. I mean, so just to say a few simple, so the concept of the good breast and the bad breast and being denied the breast and the impact that has on a child, I would argue that sometimes when we say yes to children with our voices, but our bodies don't say yes, that is more detrimental, that is more harmful. And some of the parents that I work with, the parents who are really struggling with their breastfeeding, they may be experiencing something called breastfeeding aversion. They may be really ready to start medication or start a IVF journey where breastfeeding may not be compatible, although often is. But they may have come to a place where they really want to end their breastfeeding journey. And they haven't yet given themselves permission to do that, so are continuing to breastfeed without enthusiasm, without always love, sometimes feeling resentful, sometimes it's resentment leaking out of their pores, sometimes saying to a child, yes, okay, we can breastfeed, but their body is saying no. I spoke to someone on my podcast a couple of weeks ago who talked very eloquently about, our eyes might say no, our bodies might say no, our voices might say yes. So we just have to make sure that we don't see a declining as always a negative thing. It is sometimes healthier to say to your child, oh, my love, my body's not really in the mood for doing that right now. Can we do something else instead? And, when we want little people to develop as empathic, emotionally intelligent little people, that comes from their first intimate relationship with us. That comes from these early conversations around consent and body autonomy and how we feel. We're modeling the language. We're talking about our needs mattering as well. And that transition happens very gradually when we have tiny newborns. We're very much focused on their needs, but gradually that balance shifts and it starts to become a two-way street, and our bodies and our needs start to matter too. So the healthiest weaning journeys are the ones where parents acknowledge that this is me giving myself permission to make a change. And they're not projecting things like, oh, my child's too big now, they don't need it, they're a big boy, they're a big girl, I'm stopping breastfeeding because that's best for them, I'm stopping breastfeeding because this will help them sleep better, without really having dug deep and realized, actually, no, I'm stopping breastfeeding because I want to sleep better. Little people are very happy with sleep fragmentation. It doesn't impact on little people at all in the vast majority of cases. And the idea of us telling someone that they're too big for breastfeeding, I mean, how, gaslighty that is to say to a, 3 or 4 year old, you're a big girl now, you don't need something, which they very much feel like they do need. So when we wean, ideally it's with honesty. It's with looking into ourselves and acknowledging that this is for us and that's okay. And then we acknowledge that breastfeeding has always been about emotion. So the breastfeeding endings that don't go well are the ones where we think it's about milk and we give cups of cow's milk and we put plasters on nipples and say milk is broken and gone away now, without realizing that no, this was about the emotional exchange between two people. It wasn't about the exchange of milk. It was about the exchange of security and love and connection. And little people have so little agency over their world. They move from A to B. They're told what to eat. They're told what to wear. They're told when to eat. They're told when to get dressed. And the request for a breastfeed is one of the very few things they have in their life where they're going to be immediately understood and that request will be met. It's so empowering. So often little people will ask and then not do a full feed. They're just, the asking was the exciting bit. Or they'll ask and then they'll ask for the other side, just because the act of asking for the other side is so empowering. So we have to acknowledge that the breastfeeding is so much more than just milk delivery. It's about a child having agency over their world, having the ability to say to the person they love most, hey, I need you right now. And that person saying, yes, I am here for you. So if we're going to take breastfeeding away, we have to replace it with something else where that child feels that sense of connection, physical touch, physical connection, but also that ability to feel agency. So something as simple as, well, what else can they ask for? It's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you're semi-distracted, they want to be with you. If they're not going to get a breastfeed, what else can they ask for, which is their way of saying, hey, I need you right now.
I want connection.
And it's so we're talking about a whole different language of parenting and a way that we can become upskilled in regulating our children's emotions. The other big thing is lots of people breastfeeding toddlers and older children have never seen what we used to historically call tantrums. They've never seen those meltdowns because children will just breastfeed. And you can literally go 3 years and never see a meltdown. And when you come to when breastfeeding, that is quite frightening, because for the very first time, your child may have a meltdown that will be unresolved, because emotional dysregulation is super normal. And so for the very first time, parents will be needing to cope with big feelings they've never coped with before. And they may not have had that being modeled in their own childhood experiences, and it brings up all sorts of issues around their own childhoods quite often. So there's deep stuff when it comes to weaning and ending journeys. And we start the weaning process by acknowledging that this is not just switching milk types. This is not going from human to cow's milk. This is parenting in a completely new way. And that's why ideally we let the child take the lead, because if the child does take the lead, they will gradually need breastfeeding less and less. They'll find their own ways to connect. They'll find their own ways to feel that sense of agency, and breastfeeding will naturally fade away. Obviously, I'm working a lot with people who feel they have to make a change. So we're on a spectrum most of the cases. There's very rarely pure child-led weaning, and there's very rarely pure parent-led weaning. It's often a mixture of compromise and things happening in the middle. But just finding that support, whether it's a local breastfeeding peer supporter or a friend who's been through it, it's so valuable to have that extra support helping you think through the process.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I'm sort of in this conversation. I'm about to ask you the last question, and I'm wanting to sort of amend something that I know is in the last question, because the last question is very much around building a yoga nidra to support people who are breastfeeding, and I think that what I'm thinking and feeling now is it would be really great to do to actually separate and do two separate yoga nidras, one for people who are breastfeeding and one for people who are weaning. And I think that because my vision for the breastfeeding yoga nidra is a very grounding, stable practice where the parent can do it while they're breastfeeding, and they can sort of create an alignment of mind and body and emotional energy in a sort of flow of love and nourishment on all levels, not just through the milk, but also a sort of more subtle energy that's coming through into the baby. And that having that practice once or twice a week, however often somebody wants to use it, can be a really beautiful way to just sit in full consciousness of the experience and sort of direct this into the sort of use the mind and these sort of imaginal worlds to sort of direct this flow of love and peacefulness into the baby while they're feeding. And I think that really just taking that time and that space and being so fully focused and centered would be great. And that was my initial picture of what I wanted to try and build. So I guess my first question, well, my last question, I'm going to break into two, and the one would be if I said to you, what do you think would be the a really important thing to gift to a parent who's breastfeeding in that moment of wanting to take this time and really focus on this sort of flow, this direction of love and peacefulness and nourishment into the baby? What would you say would be something like really important to remember or to include or to consider when building a yoga nidra like that? And the reason why I'm changing this is because if I do a second one for weaning, that would be a more internal thing without the baby. And that would be a thing of where is my body? How does my body feel? And mourning the separation and being able to sort of contain your own experience of it internally before then, bringing the child into the experience of, okay, this is the change that's happening now. So I'm sort of, I guess the question is the same for both of them. What is an element of breastfeeding that you think would be really key to consider when building a yoga nidra for breastfeeding? And what would be an element that'd be really key consider when building a yoga nidra for weaning?
Okay, so with a weaning one, I think the message that's really valuable is that, and this isn't my language, this comes from another lactation consultant who I once heard talk about it, called Laurie, that parenting is a series of weanings. Parenting is always about moving from one stage to the next.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the success and the beauty and the rejoicing of parenting, that if you've got it right, you're always saying goodbye to a stage, but then a new stage comes along and you have to make space for the new stage. So that idea that loss naturally slides into new gain, new experience, new growth, and picturing endings as absolutely simultaneously a beginning. So giving you, not to say that we can't feel that sense of loss, and you use that word mourning. I think we need to give ourselves space for that, but also acknowledge that this is right. It has to be this way, because this is the growth of a human. This is how humans will change, and there'll be another thing and another thing, and one day they'll leave home, and the next thing happens, and that is parenting. And I think sometimes when we're in the baby phase, we can get stuck into thinking, right, this is it now. This is it. I control this. This is me being the boss. But actually, no, this little person is in your life and you don't control them. You don't create them 100%. This is not all about nurture. You have the honor of having this little person in your life and watching them and see how they shift and change and supporting them and helping them, but you are not in control of them. You are just giving of yourself, and then the next stage happens and the next stage happens. And then in terms of breastfeeding success, and the breastfeeding version, I would encourage you to have a look at the work of someone called Anna LaGrange, who has something called Mindful Breastfeeding. Her website is mindfulbreastfeeding.co.uk. It's a lot about calming the body to just get into that space where you can let those natural processes happen. And the flow of oxytocin. Oxytocin is the hormone that governs the release of milk, and it moves the little muscles around the milk-producing cells and squeezes them, so milk literally is let down. And that is a release that has to happen. We have to let our brains do that. If we're pumping, for example, using a breast pump, it takes even more work to let that release happen, that letdown happen. So that concept of flow and the concept of letting energy flow through us into our baby is so key, and believing and trusting and thinking about what's happening on a sort of deep cellular level. And again, not expecting to control it, just as we don't control little people through the weaning process. We don't control every aspect of our breastfeeding. This is not about brains controlling it. This is happening in a place that's separate from our brains on a deeper level. And thinking about your little baby as a partner in this process. Just as we have very sophisticated parts of our bodies that make all this work, they have very sophisticated parts of their bodies too that elicit the milk ejection reflex and move milk through their bodies. It's not all down to us. We don't have to be all powerful. We don't have to have all the answers, because something is flowing through us that comes from many, many generations before us.
Yeah, it definitely seems like in all cases there's a consistent sort of call for gaining an internal foundation from which to be really confident and to lead with a sense of forward momentum that seems to sort of have continued throughout this whole conversation, and it definitely feels like it would be a really key aspect of both yoga nidras.
And when negativity comes, I don't know exactly the kind of language you want to use, but when negativity does come, that little chink in the armor, where is that from? What created that? What is the energy behind that? And as I said, often that is coming from other people's trauma, that is coming from commercialism, that's coming from someone wanting to sell us a product, that is coming from a message around measurement and the science that doesn't necessarily fit with the hormones that make breastfeeding work. So building up your armor to help you. I come from a Quaker background, so I don't mean kind of like we're militarizing breastfeeding, but that protective layer when people are trying to erode that. Where are
Mm.
they coming from? What's their motivation? How can you make your shell, your armor even stronger?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, I mean, as I said to my friend who was on your podcast before, when she introduced me to your podcast, I said to her, "Yay, boobs!" And so I'm gonna share that sentiment at the end of this as it closes, because I think that really they're just incredible, and I think the whole process is amazing, and I'm sure I sort of stopped myself from asking lots of other questions that were a bit more technical, and I tried to keep this because I knew, and we were already over an hour. But I had a whole bunch of other questions that were things like, what are some great, interesting facts that you continually keep astounding you about breastfeeding and how it all works and everything like that. And I had to sort of take out some of the questions and try and keep it sort of focus on the sort of the psychological and emotional elements at play. But yeah, yay boobs, they're great, and
Yay, boobs.
yay boobs. And then um Emma, thank you so much for this conversation, and I'm so grateful. And I really hope that the discussion that we've had here today is of value to anyone who listens to this, and I'm sure it will be. I feel very confident that this information is it's just so relevant, and it's always really nice to know that you're not alone, and there are people who are either going through the same experience or they care about the experience that you're going through and want to make it easier. And yeah, and so just a reminder to anyone that I will include some some of the articles that you mentioned and your website, emmapickettbreastfeedingsupport.com, where you can get access to more information, resources, episodes, links to buy your books. But Emma, is there anything else that you would like to share or mention or shout out or anything like that before we say goodbye?
Gosh, okay. So I mentioned Anna Lagrange. I think that's the resource that I would direct people to if they're in this kind of space. I think I would just say, if someone's listening to this antenatally, for example, make your community, make the community that you want to have. So develop your social media algorithm. Find me, follow the people I follow, create your algorithm so you create a positivity in your life about
Mm,
breastfeeding. Find your local breastfeeding counselors, find your local groups. Even though we've talked a lot about the negative messaging around breastfeeding and the people who are traumatized and the scary stuff, there is a core of people out there who are the absolute opposite of that, who are
mm,
positive and life affirming and will absolutely support you and get you to where you need to be. So find them. Don't expect them to jump in through your kitchen window. You're going to need to find them, but they are there. And breastfeeding will work out for the vast majority of people who want it to work out,
yeah.
especially if they've got the right information and they've found the right people.
Amazing. Emma, thank you so much once again. And I wish you a wonderful week ahead. And yeah, I hope to be in touch again soon at some point.
Thank you. Lovely to talk to you.
Thank you. Bye.